All right, welcome everybody to ODI's lunchtime lecture with my good friend, colleague, and confidant, Olivier Theroux. I'm Josh, I'll be your host this evening, and our talk today is on truth, trust, and technology. Now, Olivier is our head of technology, so I'm really expecting him to do good on at least one of these topics. Just some housekeeping, so if you could keep your questions until the end. Use the mic to ask the questions. It's not to enhance your volume. It's for all the listeners at home. Shout out to Fintan O'Donnell. I know you're watching. And if you are tweeting or talking about this on social media, please use the hashtag ODI Fridays. Olivier, take it away.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Josh. And thanks, everyone, for being here today. Back in May, I was pretty much here talking to some of you about a project called ARCHANGEL, which we were conducting at the time with the University of Surrey and the good people, not the Swan, the people behind the Swan, the good people of the National Archives. And it was quite an interesting project in that we had been using and developing emerging technology to help guarantee the integrity of digital records. And I used this particular slide then, and I stand by that statement that it was probably one of the only useful AI and blockchain systems out there. But it was quite an interesting idea that was behind it. And I wanted to spend a little bit more time talking with you about the notion or the role of technology in the perceived, is it true, I don't know, but in the perceived crisis of truth and trust. That's going to be easy. Trust and truth. I've got to say those words a few times today, so bear with me here. And I wanted to spend time today with you thinking about those two statements. They're polar opposites. They might still be compatible, but there's a techno-solutionist notion that tech can fix trust. And the opposite is that tech is the one thing that will break truth. And I want to spend a little bit of time today starting with the first question: can tech fix trust? So there's a belief long held that people are complicated, people are messy. Trust is a messy thing. And technology, the cold hard truth of technology, can help us with those messy people, things, that and help us create trust, underpin trust, or even fix trust. It's not new. There's an example here of that notion of the lie detector being the one thing that will tell us yay or nay whether a person is lying. And as we know, polygraphs don't really work very well. But more recently, and I'm pointing here at some work that we have commissioned by a company called Register Dynamics. Woo! Thank you. There may be one of their members here in the audience today, or just a fan. But what was really quite interesting, and this was a part of a report on data trusts that were created earlier this year. But the conclusions were very, very similar to what the ARCHANGEL project concluded, which is that there's something inherent to the underpinning principles of blockchain distributed ledger technology that makes them really quite useful to underpin trust. One of it is the immutability of blockchain and Merkle tree-based solutions. And the other one is the auditability. The fact that you've got a ledger means that it is publicly, or not publicly, but it's at least auditable. And those two notions together, the fact that it's really hard to rewrite that history and the fact that you can actually go through that history and check it, is actually quite useful to underpin some trust. And I think those reports are really, really interesting, and I would urge you to read them. But there is something a little bit problematic, perhaps, in thinking that's it. Things like blockchain are going to solve trust. There's a notion amongst blockchain-loving circles that you don't need trust. Blockchain is going to solve it. And it's quite interesting that blockchain is also called a trustless system. So which one is it? Is it trustless or is it trustworthy? But more seriously, I think we can look back at this piece of technology that is roughly 5,000 years old. Piece of clay tablet, which at the time, I'm sure there were people in the clay valley of Mesopotamia that were disrupting trust by saying, look, this piece of technology is immutable. Once you fire it, that's it. The written record is there forever. You can trust it. It's written on a piece of clay. As we know, the written word is not necessarily sufficient for trust to be maintained. And so technology and the hype around it and the hype around how much it can do to underpin human affairs kind of fades. It goes away, but it's still useful. We are still using the written word as a record of things, and we are adding technology to make it more trustworthy, or at least kind of counterbalance forces that goes against trust in those written systems and now digital systems. Another problem that we need to consider when we think about whether technology can help underpin trust is that notion of the edge of those systems. This is a term that I've been wanting to put on a slide for a very, very long time, so humor me for a minute. This is actually a term coming from, who was it? I think it was Jamie Fawcett who came up with this term. Really lovely. But what this means is that a system like ARCHANGEL, which puts signatures of digital documents into a blockchain system in order to preserve those signatures and guarantee the integrity of those documents, is only as safe and secure as the system itself. If the National Archives get a doctored document, they can only say, well, this document we received, and that has been digitized before us. We can't guarantee the integrity outside of our system. We can guarantee to some extent through technology within that system, but there's an edge to that integrity. And so even a perfect system will have its edges, and outside of those edges, we are back to using human mechanisms rather than technological mechanisms. The second question I wanted to look at with you today is the converse. Will tech break trust? And that comes from the notion that we are in a post-truth age. I think I am part of what potentially not, Karl Rove called the reality-based community. But it is true that we've got a little bit of a bit of moral panic around technology really being the thing that is going to finish breaking trust, which I think some Soviet propagandists would find somewhat amusing because they've been doing it for a long, long time. And there's been propaganda, there's been breaches of truth and trust for a long, long time, using whatever technology was available at the time. Manipulating photographs in the mid 20th century was the thing. And now we've got new things that come and that are threatening and that are worrying. And one that is really, really worrying a lot of people at the moment is deepfakes. But before that, I wanted to just go back even further than Soviet propaganda. And apologies, I know it's kind of fashionable for people to stand at a lectern and quote the classics, so I needed to put that in. But you can go back again a few millennia and have a moral panic about this written word thing is going to break truth. We won't remember things. We're going to rely on those things to record the truth for us, and we're going to forget it. All our oral culture is going to decay with this written thing. That's not me saying it. It's Plato supposedly quoting Socrates in that Phaedrus dialogue. But so we need to keep that in mind. That notion of technology is going to change our culture in such a way that we are going to forget what truth is has been there for a long time. But now let's look at that notion of deepfakes. When we started working on this presentation, I was expecting to have to explain what a deepfake is. I'm assuming that all of you here in the audience and watching this stream have seen examples of deepfakes. If not, here's one here on the screen, not courtesy, which I stole from The Guardian. borrowed from The Guardian. But that notion that kind of deep learning and other machine learning technologies make it really, really efficient and effective to create manipulated videos that are quite, there's quite a lot of verisimilitude, and you can try and trick people into thinking that the people that you have in your manipulated videos are people that are famous. Deepfakes, as most emerging technologies, started in pornography. Quite an interesting thing to just keep note here. As someone who's been working, of course it did break. Sorry, technology. Who was it that was joking that you do not invite the head of technology of the ODI to give a speech because the technology is going to fail? Apologies, I need to very briefly restart this screen. Come on, thing. There you go. Of course, this is all a conspiracy.
It's right when you mentioned pornography.
Yeah, the moment Stop it, computer, not now. Yes, quite. All right, so deepfakes have been around for a few years now, and they're getting really quite good. And this is why we're hearing about them pretty much daily in the news, or at least the tech press is awash with, this is it, we are doomed. Deepfakes are going to completely undermine truth. And it is true that it is really quite worrying. One of the most poignant points I've read about deepfakes is not so much that deepfakes will make it so that we won't, we'll be fooled by them. It is the possibility that a video or a piece of audio might be a deepfake that will be basically make us question everything. So what are we doing about that? Well, there are ways to detect video manipulations, and deepfakes there are technologies that are being developed to detect deepfakes. And so we're getting into that arms race. That's a Dr. Strangelove reference for anyone who can't see the moving image behind me. So again, in that, I believe I showed this slide again in May, but I'm really quite proud of it, even though I don't understand half of it. So our partners at the University of Surrey worked on a kind of a deep learning system to detect video manipulation. And so you can use, and that's interesting, you can use technology to battle technology that is used for disinformation. And you get into that arms race. And just last week, I was hearing Jérôme Pessanti, who's leading an AI team at Facebook, about the crazy arms race they have against people who are, and in the case that he gave, because he didn't want, for some reason, to talk too much about political manipulation. He was talking about people trying to sell drugs on Facebook, and how basically they've got systems to detect people who are trying to sell drugs through more and more innuendo and nuance and pictures that do not depict the thing, but depict a thing that could mean a thing if you know the thing. And so we've got our arms race, and yes, we can build that technology, but as I said just earlier, it's not just about that arms race. We need to think beyond the technological arms race to the fact that just a thing existing, even though we get better and better systems to detect them, the fact that we've got the possibility of manipulating videos and make it look like famous politician X said something absolutely outrageous, as if they didn't do that by themselves, is problematic. So we think that the solution, in part, is not so much about getting the technology better to detect things like deepfakes, but it's really about making sure that our culture is ready to deal with that. So one of the projects that we've joined and has been announced relatively recently, back in May again, is we're working with the likes of Full Fact and a few other fact checkers, not just to make fact checking more automated, because that's tricky, but actually to make sure that we have authoritative factual data available to people and better ways of tracing claims. So if someone says something, that we know where that came from, and that we are able to trace claims so that people have that access to the data and to information and to the ability to know where something came from. But of course, we also know that it's difficult for most people to engage with data, and so we've almost finished a project with the University of Southampton called Data Stories, which is all about figuring out how do people engage more with data. If you just think of data as rows and rows of numbers in a spreadsheet, then you've got a problem. But if you think of data as things that can be made visual, things that can be engaged with through games, through art, then we can get people and the culture to be much more attuned to data and to facts and to that notion of understanding provenance of what the facts that we are engaging with is, and then hopefully get the culture and the literacy, the technical and data literacy of our culture to be enough that things like deepfakes will not crash truth. So as I said earlier, there is something deeply troubling with the fact that just the fact that deepfakes are there could mean that people just go, oh, this is a fake. Even though you're showing something, or it might be a fake. Even though you're showing something that is patently true, and that you can have like all that provenance available to you. If people just don't trust things because there might be deepfakes, then we've got a problem. But I wanted to add a little bit of an optimistic aside here, and I want to talk about the fact that deepfakes themselves are probably not here to stay. So far, I've been in relatively stable terrain. This is the bit where I'm going to try and predict the future, which is completely a fool's errand. But I think this is relatively safe. And if I'm wrong, well, I'll live with the consequences of my bad predictions. I don't know if all of you know that notion of the uncanny valley, but it's extremely relevant to the kind of truth manipulation technologies that we are dealing with here. And the notion of the uncanny valley is that our mind is the familiarity increases with likeness to humanity. So if you have something that has, let's say, a face, we tend to react to it better. This is more familiar to us. But there's a growth in the more human that thing looks, the more familiar it is, the more we react positively to it. But at some point, there's a big dip because it starts looking uncanny. And so you've got on the one hand things that are completely unfathomable, that are so alien to us that we can't relate to it. But then, as you grow to the likes of, I don't know, things like WALL-E, for instance, somewhat bit of a face, and we relate to that well. And then we get into this type of monstrosity. With all due respect to Steven Spielberg, I believe. And so I'm going to quote someone that way. I'm not going to be the only one insulting those filmmakers and the millions that they put into it. This is, I think, from Peter Bradshaw. Yeah, Peter Bradshaw from The Guardian. It's like it's shriekingly phony. It's not that. It's just that we've got a visceral response to things that look almost there but not quite. And this is why you've got other makers of media, such as Makoto Shinkai in Japan. A place that has been working a lot on robotics and in that kind of verisimilitude to humanity in their robots. And what I think is particularly interesting with Makoto Shinkai, and I hope you can see it in this picture, is that he's working with really, really hyper-realistic landscapes. But when it comes to the characters, he goes for that kind of cartoonish images because he knows, and the industry knows, and I don't understand why that kind of Hollywood-based media goes for hyper-reality, because this is much more relatable, even though no one has eyes like this, of course not. But you can convey emotion, and you can really relate to that because it's just at that tip of that of that curve of relatability just before it dips into that weird, apologies, sponsors, I didn't mean to knock you. And there's another reason why I think that Uncanny Valley is going to really hit hard when it comes to things like deepfakes. It is that we tend to think of deepfakes as something that's going to happen for politics mostly. And it really hit home for me when I read this tweet by an academic in Australia. I'm not going to read it to you because it's really, for me, it made my insides shriek. As you walk into shopping malls, your face, and that of your friends, will appear right in front of you on digital billboards. You'll wear the newest sunglasses and your skin will have been virtually rejuvenated with the latest cosmetic products. For me, and that is a personal thing. You know, for others, they might have really, really strong reactions to other scenarios. But for me, the idea that we're going to mix that uncanny valley-ness of, you know, generated deepfakes, videos with the alienation of seeing oneself but not quite is going to really, really hit back quite hard. And sorry, I keep hitting that poor thing. The message I'm trying to convey here, and I hope I'm not trying to make it more profound than it is, but is that we've got here a problem that is inherently technological, and that the response to it is not a purely technical one. There are ways to detect deepfakes, but the response to it is cultural, and it's also legal. California has just announced, and I think they're the second state in the US, but more and more legislatures are basically announcing thou shalt not. There are now more and more laws that say that deepfakes cannot be used for certain things. I don't think there's any country that has banned them completely outright, because then you would have to define it very, very clearly, and that's quite hard. But basically, no video manipulation allowed for political advertising is what California has gone with, which is quite interesting. So, trying to wrap this up, I want to start by saying I don't have all the answers. We don't have all the answers. This is an ever complex and ever changing landscape. But I hope that through these two examples of using distributed ledgers and kind of immutable data structures like blockchains, and that question of whether certain applications of AI will really shatter the truth, that we've started answering those two questions of whether technology is the problem or the solution. New tech. So is it the problem? It's a problem. It can be problematic because it changes, and it changes fast. And so, yes, there is a problem, but new tech like deepfakes probably won't break truth any more than Photoshop did. That's another prediction. I could be wrong, but we need to work at it. And we need to work at it not just through technology. And conversely, new tech like blockchain won't fix trust. It might be useful, it might underpin trust, but it won't fix it any more than things like LinkedIn fixed trust or clay tablets. But it can help. And so that leads us to the question of what do we do then with technology? It's not the problem, it's not the solution, it's just there. It's there, but it's important. And as we just saw, it can be used to underpin trust, but it can also be used to damage trust. And so, and I know that this feels probably like motherhood and apple pie a little bit, but a healthy society needs trustworthy tech, and vice versa, maybe. And so, I think that what we looked at today kind of looks like this if you try to structure it. That in order to have a society where truth and trust are maintained, we need access to facts. We need things like better systems for provenance and governance, so access and not access. And all those are quite technical. Technology has a big role to play in these. But conversely, as we saw with the notion that California was banning deepfakes for political advertising, there are things that society has to do that are not massively technical, where technology is just there as an auxiliary. So regulation, laws, certification and audits, all of those things are useful and related to technology, but they're not technology itself. But perhaps the most interesting is that bit in the middle. And I wanted to read you something that Sam Gregory from the charity Witness wrote recently that I found quite important. And he says, "Don't build anything without consulting the most affected." And he's talking about deepfakes there again. "Talk to the people who are most vulnerable to deepfakes. Even if the goal is to create a deepfake detector, there are plenty of social questions involved. Will it be available for people in other countries? Will it be trained to spot political fakes or gender and sexual violence? Once the infrastructure is set, it's really marginalized people and populations who are excluded because they don't have the agency to change that infrastructure." And that's really, that is specific to deepfakes, but actually in every single use of technology, those questions are relevant. Who is going to be affected by this? Who is going to be affected by not having access to this technology? That kind of negative space of technology is something that we tend to forget. We tend to think, oh, well, use case, user stories, yeah. We're helping a specific set of users with that technology. But who doesn't have access to that technology is also important. And so that notion of thinking about ethical considerations is really key. And as Sam says in this quote I just read, engaging with people who are going to be affected rather than just thinking on their behalf is quite important. And equitability of technology is something that we don't talk about quite enough. And that's really interesting to me because that's between those two ends of not very technical and quite technical, and that's what keeps it all together. Hopefully, I haven't completely confused you with talks of Tarkovsky and Tintin kind of mixed together. If I have, I apologize, but I would extend an invitation to continue this conversation. This is just me at this point in time saying it's complicated. There's hope. There's work to do. And I wanted to give a shout out, because otherwise Hannah here is going to never let me come to a lunchtime lecture again, that the next step in this conversation is actually going to be at our summit. We'll have quite a few sessions, but one of the sessions in particular will be about practical data ethics, and I would love to see you there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Olivier. We now have some time for questions. I'll be passing around the mic. Make sure you speak into the mic so people that are not in this room can hear you, because, like I said before, it will not amplify your voice. I'm happy to start off with my question that I wrote myself, was not given by Olivier, even though it's on the exact same paper as his cue cards.
That would be very unethical.
Very unethical. So, Olivier, why would increased access to data help fight disinformation if most people only trust their side?
That's a really great question, Josh.
Go on.
That did sound like a plan, didn't it? So this is a really important question. When we talk about trust and truth, there's that notion that I said earlier. Let's get more access to data so that people can relate to that, and let's get them more engaged with data through things like visualization, through games, through art, through any cultural mechanism we can, because raw data is quite hard. There's one bit of hope that I have read about quite recently, and it comes actually from the Full Fact research team, the UK fact-checking charity. They looked at that notion of the backfire effect. I don't know if any of you has heard about that. But essentially, the idea of the backfire effect is that when someone is entrenched in their opinion, giving them data, facts that would supposedly change their mind because, oh yeah, you're right. Thanks you for showing me this data. That there's this notion that actually it backfires. That when you receive data that doesn't align with your deeply entrenched opinions, that you just reject it and get even more entrenched in your opinions. I actually believed that theory to be true, but Full Fact recently did a landscape of studies and have seen that actually the backfire effect doesn't seem to be a thing. So there is hope in that actually possibly showing people facts, data, and I think the importance there of provenance, making sure you explain where it comes from and who are those people, and let them see where that data came from and how it's been collected. So you need a lot of work on transparency and provenance. But then again, full fact would say that, wouldn't they?
Thank you very much. I look forward to arguing with people on social media now. Anyone have a question in the room? Start over here.
Hi, Sam Cunningham, CEO of Polymonitor. I'd agree with your point around kind of giving people better access to data to hopefully be better informed. But I just wondered if you get your take on what you think the kind of the ecosystem is like, or how healthy it is in terms of various players coming forward to help crunch kind of all this data, and especially people who are, from what I can see, a lot of people perhaps coming forward to do that for kind of private interest, but not necessarily for public good.
Those of you here probably are here because you're friends of the ODI. So I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but yeah, you're completely right. Creating an ecosystem of data where data is not just kept aside for pure purposes, hoarded, or vice versa, that where data is used and collected in trustworthy ways is quite important. And at the moment, we're not there yet. We've had scandals, we've had problems. So creating the mechanisms for more transparency, more openness, but also more trust is quite important. We're not there yet, but there are signs that the ecosystem is maturing. So we are coming from a world maybe a decade ago where there was basically, I don't know, a little bit of thinking about data mining, but not really any consideration about what it means for people. And there was a budding idea about open data being useful for transparency. And we have really gone quite a long way. There's quite a lot more to do. I would agree with you. But I think we are kind of on a positive slant.
Just as a follow-up to that, in terms of not just an ecosystem of data, but would you envisage a world where there's just more sort of players, I don't know what they are, but organisations who can like go in and use that data in different ways? I mean, I remember thinking back to a time when I was at the Department for Education, and the government was very keen to put all this data out there and about kind of school results and things like that, and hoping essentially that an ecosystem of people would come forward to say, yes, we'll use this data and come up with weird and wonderful ways to present it to parents who can keep schools and teachers' feet to the fire to improve standards. And to be honest, that didn't come forward because I never really felt that community of organisations to build those tools to make that analysis never came forward, because I didn't really feel there was ever the resources or support or motivations for them to do it. And I just don't know if that's kind of my question, I guess. It's kind of, does it exist? And if it doesn't exist, how do you think people should be encouraging it to exist?
I mean, ecosystems don't build themselves in a day. You've got to fix some of the infrastructure. You know, if you don't have access or good licenses for it, you can't do that. If you don't have the right quality, if you don't have the right findability, and we're really still at some levels fixing those things. So the ability to use data, contextualize it, present it so that people are better informed, great. But if they can't find the data to begin with, or can't use it because it's in terrible shape. So yeah, the work that we're still doing as a community, data practitioners, is quite infrastructural, and therefore we don't see that many yet. Good usage, good contextualization, good presentation of the data, but we've got some. There are good services that use data. There are people who are quite good at showing data. Our national broadcaster is pretty good at it. So we should get there, but there's quite a big layer that's needed, and that we need to work on.
Thank you very much.
I think there was one question here, and then here and here.
Thank you. You shared that quote about the shopping center where you'd walked in.
I'll put it back on the screen.
You said that was all terrible and really creepy. Maybe you could explain exactly what it is that you think is so bad about this marketing approach that is very real right now.
As I said, it's a very personal reaction. There is, in my mind, something very alienating and abusive to seeing myself represented in ways that I don't have agency for. The idea that someone took my image and made it into something that it's now playing back at me to sell me something feels quite viscerally abusive. That bit. Yeah, no, seriously, no, I am not joking. And I'm not saying this is a very personal thing. I'm assuming that some people will be completely cool with it, but for me, it is really a violating thing.
So is it because when you walked in, you were not aware that the image was being taken, or was it because you really didn't want to buy those very, very attractive trainers?
No, it's a fundamental thing. It is a fundamental thing about what it is to be me and what it is to see myself in you're really violating the whole principles of identity and memory by doing that.
Okay, that's really what I'm trying to get to, because it is about a consent issue.
It is partly about consent, but I mean, genuinely,
it's more emotional.
I think for me it's a very visceral thing.
I wouldn't like to see myself younger. Okay, I would like to see myself younger. I would like to see myself younger, but I mean, as a human, as a being, we evolve. We born, then we reach maturity, then we die. You know? And then using my images, youngest images of myself, or the digital young image of myself, in order to sell something, I wouldn't enjoy, I wouldn't like. Is that using now the marketing, they use someone else's image, and a model or something like that. Now it's more close to us because they can use VR, AR, any type of manipulation in order to sell, but it's a bit weird.
Yeah. and we may,
apart from
to build upon what Davide was saying here, we can be maybe desensitized to it. I mean, the fact that we are getting used to applications that put filter on us, that we are using upon ourselves, we may be getting used to it, and maybe that in 10 years, I'll look back at what I just said today and go, that's so cute. But at the moment, I think this is a violation of my notion of identity and memory, and I can't explain it much more than that. I'm not, sadly, enough of a philosopher to explain that, but are there philosophers in the room?
Probably we don't use much dreams. So we don't like it.
So we had a few more questions.
Yeah.
Thank you. So it's kind of related to the first question that came up, especially, so I come from an organisation that does a lot of work on the kind of equity and engagement type of thing. And my question is, that basically where you think the resources are going to come from to develop that, because what we found really works is something that is very in-depth, resource-intensive, with a very small group of people, and you have to choose those people quite carefully and target them and understand a lot about them before you start working with them on this stuff. And that's not really the scale of impact that the people that are creating the technology or the laws on either side of that want to talk to you about. They want something that is much, much cheaper and works with a lot more people. So I'm just interested in your take on that, and whether you think it's because whether they think they care enough to actually invest at the scale that is needed to make change on that middle thing.
It's a great question. So I'm going to answer as a technologist. I don't have all the answers. I keep saying that, but genuinely I don't. But as a technologist who's been working in kind of relatively disruptive fields for 20 years, I can tell you that the field of technology is realizing that we've been extremely naive, that we have not done our homework in terms of ethics, engagement, equity. That we've been, that motto of move fast and break things was completely cool only 5 years ago, and that's changing fast. And so the second part of my answer is I think actually the tech companies and companies that use technology or develop it will be more and more incentivized to do that work, even though it is expensive, because not doing it would be more expensive. So some of them will see it, and we're already seeing that in our work on data ethics. Some companies are seeing it as a commercial, definitely not a commercial person, a commercial advantage. That's not the word I was looking for, but I'll take it. Thank you very much, Jenny. So as a commercial advantage to be ethical and to be transparent and to do that engagement work. And some are seeing it as an insurance policy against scandals. Either way, they are more and more incentivized to do the right thing. So whether they will actually put the right amount of investment, as you were saying, these are really heavy processes, and tech is quite happy generally with having a very small staff and a lot of capital, and doing the reverse is quite anathema to the tech industry. But that's a change that I think is going to come, because otherwise they will keep being hit by scandals, and the general population is going to be demanding it more and more. We've got one question here.
Yeah. Is it commercial offering you're looking for? No.
Hi.
Competitive advantage.
Competitive advantage.
So was an advantage was the right. No, never mind. Sorry, go ahead.
So the question is kind of a bit more taking the whole thing about data and facts to a bit more granular, or maybe a bit more to the core. So is it like a question between glass half full and glass half empty, or is it like between left versus right in terms of political spectrum? Because there is a lot of things that happens beyond a factual number, like somebody winning one thing or one death or something, but then there is a lot of things that layers that one fact. So where do we stand in that engagement or argument?
So I'm going to half answer this, because I think you'd need a political scientist to answer it properly. My view of this, my perception of this is that there is an increased visibility of a political discourse that is effective and not factual. Now, whether that is a cyclical thing or a rise in it, or a pendulum, I don't know. All I know is what we can do about it. And that might be a little bit solutionist. That may be the technologist in me thinking, I don't know why, but I'm going to try and figure out the how. So I don't quite know what specifics of the kind of political spectrums are more or less attuned to data, but we know that people are getting more and more data literate. They used to be fed statistics, and now they're actually much more attuned to just saying, here's the data, have a look at the data. And as we progress towards that, the political discourse will change, hopefully. We had two more questions, and then we might see if there are questions from the Twitters. Not yet. Okay.
Hello. One of the things that we just covered in one of the previous questions was about what is the incentive to act properly, and particularly what's the incentive to act ethically. Obviously, having regulation and laws is one good way. One of the things that we looked at in the data trust report was actually how do you make doing the right thing with data as reputationally relevant as doing the right thing with money. So obviously if you misuse your money or you forge your accounts, you get in serious trouble. How do you get to the same point with data, I guess was my question. Quite a big question.
Yeah, good one. So what's interesting is that, and the ODI loves talking in spectrums, and this is again a spectrum. Laws are slow, and so we can't just rely on laws. Regulation is typically kind of bounded by sectors, and therefore we can't just rely on that. The work that we are doing, and actually that we worked with you on that data trust pilot work, is about figuring out whether we can create data institutions that are underpinned by legislation, by regulation, by repeatable frameworks like legal frameworks. The data trust is essentially about, well, it's partly about that, by technology. And when you have all that together, you have incentives, but also frameworks that keep actors kind of guide them to do the right thing. Having that notion of trustees that are in charge of making sure data is used in the best interest of the people that are affected by this data is one way to do that. So you create boundaries that do that. But yeah, literally, I think I think you need the whole of all those points for it to be healthy and for people to do the right thing. Well, for most people to do the right thing. Some people will do the right thing just because they think like that. Some people think that it is competitive advantage. But in order to have more people doing that without just waiting for laws to catch up, then yeah, we'll need frameworks, we'll need structures, and we'll need incentives. We had one more question here.
Hello, I'm Janine. I'm a software engineer and also a Tintin fan.
The movie or the comics?
All of them, I'm afraid. Don't worry, I won't.
Wait.
We won't go into it. So I think I have a question based on if I've interpreted this correctly. You're kind of indicating hypervisualization is something that can fuel deepfakes and is a problem, if I got that right.
Can you give me a little more detail about what you're thinking? Because I'm not sure I understand.
Oh, so how I interpreted these slides and comparing it with the Japanese anime.
Between this and that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The whole idea, because my question was going to be like, I've always interpreted this as people pushing boundaries on computer graphics. And as a fan of animated films and video games, and the fact that SIGGRAPH as a conference exists, this shows that people are also excited about pushing boundaries.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask if I got it correct that this is something that's fueling deepfakes or was seen as a problem. How can educating in computer graphics and pushing those boundaries coexist with educating people about deepfakes?
That's a really good question. And I think there are two strands to the answer. One of the strands is it's not just about the novelty and the pushing of it. There is a genuine thing about once it becomes very, very similar to what we're used to in reality, we start looking for the little details. And there's so Tintin, sorry, there were a lot of reviews that said it's beautiful, but it's soulless. There's nothing in those eyes. And I don't know. And there's something in there that, you know, in the words of another famous technologist, you've been thinking so much about whether you could, you haven't really thought about whether you should. Yeah, tick. But you said something quite important there about the education and and how we get habituated to things, and it may well be that little by little that uncanny valley will kind of lift because we'll just get used to it. And it's less and less weird to us, and we're not stop looking for the thing in those eyes. But whether more education on computer graphics will help people deal with manipulation for kind of nefarious purposes, I don't think so, because I genuinely think that most of the population have seen really good CGI. They know it's very good CGI. The problem with deepfakes is at another level, that knowing it exists. I think that's now fairly accepted, that technology is good enough to really try and fool you. Although, interestingly, the one case of someone being fooled out of a lot of money was done with audio, not video. And that, again, gets back to my that gut reaction with deepfakes, it being viscerally rejecting it. Much easier to fool people with audio than with video. If there's one thing that we need to be worried about, it's not the videos, it's the human voice, because that's easier to trick the mind into.
We have time for another. One
more question.
Thank you. Hi. More of a sort of conversation starter than, I don't know. The question is, in our world where we have our news curated by whatever massive organisation who could have their own interests, which aren't necessarily in the best public interest. It's hard to be, finding objective truth, and also we all seem to be descending into echo chambers of our own personal interest surrounded by people who are similar to us, and how does anybody, from different sides of any argument come together to find common ground and find truth? And also the fact that, things which, say, for example, government address as, needs, how do they determine those? I was thinking maybe an idea I always thought the European referendum was a bad idea, just to say. But if we're going to have a referendum, why not have more? Why not have them every day, every week, whatever, where we sort of provoke questions that we actually want addressed, and then we actually all answer what we think, and then maybe that could be a way of measuring public opinion in a real and unbiased way, using some sort of blockchain technology for that. I don't know. What my question was going to be, what is the biggest missing piece of the puzzle of this ecosystem of truth? I don't know the answer.
That's a
Hopefully
good
you can
one
shed
to
some light
finish
on
on. I'm not going to address everything. I'm going to set aside the questions about referenda because nope. But on the information and the health of our information ecosystem and how we deal with it, I actually think we're in a good place. I know it doesn't necessarily sound like that because social media looks a lot like a constant shouting match. But if you look at studies, what I've seen so far is that actually people know about the notion of filter bubbles. People know that there are algorithms that are hyper curated for them. And for some things, they're going to be happy with it for a while. For entertainment, they're probably going to be okay with it being just comfortable. But actually for information, more and more people are actively looking beyond it. And to some extent, the answer is, well, know when convenience is a good thing and know where convenience is not the right thing for you and do the work. And we're seeing studies, it's somewhat generational, but we're seeing studies that people are going beyond the bubbles because they know that the bubbles exist and they actually want varied information. Not the whole world, and the future is unevenly distributed. Another quote tick. But I'm quite optimistic and hopeful about that because people know about those the fact that technology tend to reduce your field of view for convenience, and they actually go beyond that. About putting it all on a blockchain, no, don't. And I think we'll end on that because we're out of time.
Thank you so much,
Thank you very
everyone,
much,
for
everyone.
joining, and thank you, Olivier, for your wonderful talk.